She was a force of nature, a teenage peasant girl who couldn't read or write, yet could command armies and crown a king. She broke one of the most decisive sieges in European history and turned the tide of the 100 Years' War. Her enemies, the most powerful military in Europe, couldn't beat her on the battlefield. They'd thrown everything they had at her, and she had scattered them. So they chose a different weapon, a quieter, more insidious one. They decided to defeat her not with swords, but with a single, impossible question. This is the story of the brilliant and cruel theological trap set for Joan of Arc, a legal gauntlet designed so that any path she took, any answer she gave, would lead straight to the flames. It was an intellectual execution, long before the executioner ever lit the pyre. To understand the trap, you have to understand the threat she posed. By 1429, France was on its knees. Decades of brutal war with England had left the kingdom fractured and demoralized. The English and their Burgundian allies held Paris and most of northern France. The French claimant to the throne, the Dauphin Charles, was uncrowned, indecisive, and on the verge of total collapse. The city of Orleans, a strategic linchpin, had been under siege for months. Its fall seemed inevitable, and with it, the end of an independent France. Then she arrived, a teenager from a remote village, claiming God had sent her. Joan of Arc was an anomaly, a complete disruption to the natural order. In an era defined by rigid hierarchies, she shattered every convention. She spoke of visions of saints and angels who had given her a divine mission: drive the English out of France and see the Dauphin crowned king. Against all logic, the desperate French court gave her a shot, and she delivered. Arriving at Orleans in late April 1429, she inspired a series of stunning assaults that, in just 9 days, broke the siege. By May 8th. The English, who had been on the cusp of ultimate victory, were routed. This was followed by a string of victories along the Loire Valley. Joan didn't just win battles, she revitalized an entire nation. Her presence was a symbol of divine favor, inspiring fanatical devotion in French soldiers and a primal fear in their enemies. To the English, she was no holy maiden. She was a witch, a heretic whose dark powers were worth more than 100 men-at-arms. Her victories weren't just military defeats, they were theological crises. If God was truly on her side, what did that say about their own cause? They couldn't just kill her, they had to discredit her, her mission, and her God. Just a year after her triumph at Orleans, on the 23rd of May 1430, Joan's military career came to an abrupt end. During a skirmish, she was pulled from her horse by a Burgundian archer and captured. For her captors, she was the ultimate prize. After months in captivity during which she made a desperate 60-foot leap from a tower window to escape, her fate was sealed. The English, eager to get their hands on the woman who had humiliated them, paid a king's ransom for her, 10,000 livres. They didn't want a prisoner of war, they wanted a symbol to destroy. She was brought to Rouen, the heart of English power in France. There, her battle would shift from the muddy fields of war to the sterile confines of a courtroom. But this wasn't going to be an ordinary trial. It was a political show trial from the start, a piece of legal theater designed for a single outcome: her death. The man chosen to lead it was Pierre Cauchon, the Bishop of Beauvais, a staunch pro-English partisan whose own diocese Joan had helped conquer. The court he assembled was a stacked deck of clerics, theologians, and lawyers, all chosen for their English sympathies or their vulnerability to English pressure. Joan, an illiterate 19-year-old, was given no legal advisor to help her navigate the maze of canon law. Any evidence that might have helped her was systematically suppressed. Meanwhile, secret registrars were told to alter the official court records, twisting her words against her. Her torment began before the first question was even asked. She was kept in a secular prison under English control, treated not as a prisoner of war, but as a dangerous animal. At first, she was held in an iron cage, shackled at the neck, hands, and feet. Later, she was moved to a cell but remained chained to a heavy wooden block, with English soldiers guarding her from times inside, times the room, day and night. This denied her any privacy and left her constantly vulnerable. Deeply pious, she was also denied the sacraments of confession and Mass, a spiritual torment she begged to have lifted. The public trial sessions began on the 21st of February 1431. For months, Joan was subjected to grueling interrogations, first in public and then privately in her cell. She stood alone, dressed in the male clothing she'd worn on campaign, facing a hostile assembly of the most educated men in France. They came at her with a mountain of accusations, 70 charges in total. They questioned every part of her life. They demanded to know about her voices. Where did she hear them? Could she touch her saints? They grilled her on her prophecies and her decision to leave home. They pressed her on why she wore men's clothing, framing it not as a practical choice for a soldier, but as an abomination against God. Every question was a potential snare, designed to corner her into admitting to heresy, witchcraft, or fraud. They were trying to prove her visions came from the devil, not from God. They presented her with complex theological paradoxes, hoping her lack of education would lead her to incriminate herself. But time and again, she stunned the court with her sharp, cautious, and surprisingly witty answers. When they asked what her saints looked like, she deflected. When they demanded to know the secret sign she had given her king, she refused, saying it was a matter between her king, and God. She parried their legal attacks with simple, unshakable faith. Her interrogators grew frustrated. Her cleverness was making them look foolish. They needed something definitive that would force her into a corner with no escape. It was her greatest strength, her absolute conviction that she was on a mission from God, that they decided to turn into her greatest weakness. It was during one of these intense public sessions, on February 27th, that one of the chief interrogators, a man named Jean Beaupère, posed the question. It was a simple query, but one loaded with damnation. He asked, "Are you in a state of God's grace?" To our ears, that might sound abstract, but in the 15th century, for a person on trial for heresy, it was a flawless trap. The entire room understood the deadly genius of it. Here's why the question was so impossible to answer. According to church doctrine, no person could know for certain that they were in God's grace. To claim you knew was to presume upon the secret knowledge of God himself, an act of supreme arrogance and a prosecutable heresy. So, if Joan answered yes, she would be a heretic. She would have just confessed, in her own words, to a massive sin, proving she was a fraud. Her trial could end right there. But what if she said no? If she answered, "No, I am not in a state of grace," she would be admitting to being a sinner. This would instantly invalidate her entire mission. How could a sinner, cut off from God, be the chosen messenger of heaven? Her voices would be declared demonic, her victories the product of witchcraft, and her entire story a lie. She would have admitted her own guilt. It was a perfect intellectual pincer move. Yes meant heresy. No meant guilt. Both answers led directly to condemnation and the stake. The learned doctors leaned forward. They had her. The uneducated peasant girl was finally caught in their web. There was no right answer. A long silence filled the chamber. The scribe's quills were poised, ready to record the confession that would seal her fate. After a moment, she looked at her interrogators and gave an answer so brilliant, so unexpected, it left the entire court stunned. She said, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." The trap was sprung, but she wasn't in it. With a single sentence, she had slipped right through their fingers. She hadn't claimed to know God's will, so she wasn't a heretic, and she hadn't admitted to being a sinner, so she hadn't confessed guilt. She had answered with a humble prayer that was theologically perfect. She honored church doctrine while reaffirming her faith in God. The court was flabbergasted, and the session was abruptly adjourned for the day. For a moment, a teenage girl with no legal training had outwitted the sharpest theological minds in the country. Joan's brilliant answer won her the intellectual battle, but it couldn't win her the war. Her fate had been decided before she ever set foot in Rouen. The trial wasn't a search for truth. It was a mechanism for political assassination. If they couldn't trap her with theology, they would crush her with brute force. The public interrogations stopped, and the fight moved back to the shadows of her cell. In April, Joan fell gravely ill, likely from food poisoning. Fearing she might die of natural causes and rob them of their public spectacle, her English captors sent doctors. Their goal wasn't to save her life, but to keep her alive long enough to be burned. When she still refused to submit, They resorted to direct threats. In early May, she was taken to the castle's torture chamber and shown the instruments. They hoped the sight would break her. It didn't, she told them calmly. Truly, if you were to tear my limbs apart and drive my soul from my body, I would not tell you anything more. The threat failed. They knew she would only recant any forced confession later. Realizing their case was weak, Cauchon's commission cut the 70 charges down to just 12. These focused on what they felt were the easiest to prosecute: the supposedly diabolical nature of her visions, her refusal to submit to their authority, and, most visibly, the crime of wearing men's clothing. On the 24th of May 1431, they made their final move. Joan was taken to a scaffold in the cemetery of Saint Ouen. A crowd had gathered. A sermon condemned her. Before her stood two terrible choices: a document of abjuration, a confession renouncing her voices, or an executioner ready to take her to the stake. Under the immense pressure, facing the immediate horror of being burned alive, Joan relented. She signed the document, which she likely couldn't read, with a simple cross. Her sentence was announced: not freedom, but perpetual imprisonment. But Joan's abjuration wasn't the victory the English needed. A living martyr in a prison cell was still a symbol of hope. They needed her dead and publicly disgraced as a heretic. And so, they set one last, cruel trap. After her confession, Joan was returned to her English-run prison. Her head was shaved, and she was forced into a dress. In this vulnerable state, according to her own later testimony, she was subjected to new horrors, including attempted rape by her guards. Just 4 days after she had promised to give up her old ways, on May 28, the judges were informed that she had relapsed. They entered her cell to find her once again in men's clothing. When they demanded to know why, she told them the truth. She explained she had been tricked, and that wearing men's attire offered her some small protection against assault. More importantly, she used the moment to defiantly recant her coerced confession. She declared she had only signed the document out of fear of the fire and that her voices had returned, chastising her for her weakness. She reaffirmed that her visions were truly from God. This was exactly what Cauchon and his masters had been waiting for. By their twisted logic, she was now a relapsed heretic. The first offense could be forgiven, but a relapse meant only one sentence: death. On the morning of the 30th of May 1431, the verdict was delivered. She was led to the old market square in Rouen, where a tall pyre had been built. She was tied to the stake. As the flames rose around her, she asked for a cross to be held up before her eyes. Her final, agonizing cries were not of fear, but of faith. Eyewitnesses reported she screamed the name Jesus until smoke and fire consumed her. To ensure no relics could be collected, the English burned her body twice more, then gathered her ashes and threw them into the Seine River. The English had gotten what they wanted. Joan of Arc was dead, her name blackened as a heretic. But a verdict like that couldn't stand forever. Truth, however deeply buried, often finds its way to the light. 25 years later, after the war had finally turned and the French had reclaimed their lands, a new trial was opened. At the request of Joan's aging mother, and with the authorization of Pope Calixtus III, an appellate trial was convened in 1455 to re-examine the case. Over 100 witnesses were called, and the old court records were scrutinized. The investigation exposed the original trial for what it was: a sham. The final verdict, delivered on the 7th of July 1456, declared the original proceedings had been conducted with corruption, deceit, calumny, fraud, and malice. It was officially nullified. Joan's name was cleared, and a cross was ordered to be erected at the site of her execution. Her vindication was complete, but her legacy was just beginning. The peasant girl they tried to erase from history became France's patron saint. The heretic they burned at the stake was canonized as a saint of the Catholic Church in 1920. The trap they set for her, that impossible question about being in a state of grace, failed to condemn her in the moment. Instead, it has echoed through history as a testament not to her guilt, but to her extraordinary faith and intelligence in the face of unimaginable cruelty. They thought a single question could undo a miracle. They were wrong. Joan's story is a powerful reminder that even when faced with an impossible choice, faith and courage can forge a different path.